All right, today we're talking about a true giant of South Asian politics, Khaleda Zia. She was one of the most influential and, let's be honest, controversial leaders the region has ever seen. Her story, it's really the story of Bangladesh's own wild, turbulent journey.
So when she passed away at 79, it really felt like a massive political era in Bangladesh just ended. A huge, dramatic chapter closed for good. And here's the thing, if you really want to get a handle on modern Bangladesh, you absolutely have to understand her story.
So, the big question is, who was Begum Khaleda Zia? I mean, she was a prime minister, sure, but she was also a political prisoner, a widow who was basically thrown into the political deep end. She was a leader who shaped her country for more than 30 years. It's an incredible story, so let's get into it.
Her path to power was, well, it was anything but ordinary. This wasn't someone who planned for a life in politics from day one. Not at all. In a lot of ways, politics found her, and it found her through a terrible tragedy. I mean, think about it. She started out as a captain's wife, living a pretty quiet, private life. And what's really fascinating is that she never got a formal degree. She actually called herself self-educated. That's such a world away from the incredibly powerful political force she eventually became, right? And her rise was just incredibly fast. After her husband, who was the president by then, was assassinated, the party leaders were desperate. They basically begged her to step in and save the Bangladesh Nationalist Party from totally falling apart. And get this, in just 3 years, this woman with zero political experience went from a grieving widow to the chairperson of a major political party. Just like that. Okay, so this next part of her story is where she really becomes the leader we remember. Her whole political identity was forged in the fire, you could say, fighting against a military dictatorship. And it all boiled down to this one simple phrase: Urshad must go. That was it. That was her slogan in the 80s. So simple, so direct, but unbelievably powerful. It became the rallying cry for a whole movement to bring back democracy and get the military ruler, General Urshad, out of power. And this is how she got that reputation as the uncompromising leader. It came from making really tough, decisive calls, like when she led the boycott of the 1986 election. Look, she could have participated, maybe gotten some short-term political wins, but she refused. She said nope, arguing that taking part would just make the military regime look legitimate. That single move right there locked in her image as this principled leader who wouldn't back down. All right, so after all that struggle to restore democracy, she finally comes to power. And this is where things get even more interesting. She doesn't just make history. She kicks off a rivalry that would literally define Bangladeshi politics for a generation. So in 1991, it happens. She becomes the first female prime minister of Bangladesh. Just think about that for a second. This was huge. A massive barrier shattered, not just for her country, but for the entire Muslim world at the time. A real trailblazer. And you really can't tell Khaleda Zia's story without talking about her great rival, Sheikh Hasina. Their competition was intense. It was personal. It lasted for decades. And it was so central to everything happening in the country that people had a name for them, the battling Begums. Seriously, their rivalry was the story in Bangladeshi politics for years. Now, this rivalry wasn't just about personality. No, it had massive real-world consequences, especially when it came to how they dealt with their giant neighbor, India. Khaleda Zia was always much more cautious, more nationalist in her approach, which often made for some pretty tense, strained relations. Sheikh Hasina, on the other hand, took the opposite tack, pushing for warmer and more cooperative ties. So the final chapter of her life is a really tough one. It's a huge shift from the prime minister's office to courtrooms and eventually hospital beds, a really challenging end. Her last years were just this crazy cycle of legal fights. In 2018, she's convicted on graft charges and sent to prison. Now, her supporters have always screamed that this was all politically motivated. Then she's released to house arrest because her health is failing. It was this constant back and forth until she was finally freed after the government changed in 2024. And her health problems really became a huge public issue. I mean, for years, she was battling all these serious illnesses. And the fight just to get her medical treatment overseas, well, that turned into another massive political battleground. So when you look back at it all, how do you even begin to sum up a life this big, this complicated? Her legacy is just full of contradictions, isn't it? You've got these incredible pioneering moments right alongside some really deep controversies. So what's the final verdict? Well, you can't deny she was a pioneer for women in leadership. For her followers, she'll always be a symbol of democracy and strength. For her critics, she's a much more controversial, divisive figure. But I think one thing everyone can agree on is that her life showed the incredibly high personal price you pay for being in the political fight in Bangladesh. There's this one take from some analysts that I think really nails her historical importance. They say her rise symbolized Bangladesh's resilience in reclaiming democracy after military rule. And that's it, right? The housewife turned prime minister perfectly mirrored the country's own struggle to get out from under military rule and stand on its own 2 feet as a democracy. At the end of the day, her story is one of triumph, of tragedy, and just this incredible, unwavering resolve. She shattered barriers, she led massive movements, and man, she paid a heavy price for it all. So I guess the final question we're left with is, how will history judge her? How will the country she shaped for decades remember its very first female prime minister?